I've always had a fascination with abandoned buildings. Ever since I was old enough, I would gather my friends and we'd go on a trip to any neglected construction site or haunted neighborhoods we could find. The adrenaline of being somewhere you don't belong just stuck with me. I would occasionally go exploring on my own just for the extra rush. Loneliness just adds a powerful vibe. You could say I was an adrenaline junkie. Recently, I went on an exploration that made me rethink my adventures. It was a nice summer day in Chicago. I was visiting some friends who went to a community college there, and one of them had given me a tip on an abandoned building that I should check out. Of course, I was going to have a look. It'd almost be crazy for me not to. It was already the afternoon, nearing nightfall. My friend mentioned that the place was an abandoned parking building that was underused and was inevitably closed off. I had packed myself some Lunchables, a flashlight, and water. The second I arrived, I got immediate chills. Sure enough, and fitting the description, it was an abandoned parking building. I forgot to mention, I also brought a Polaroid camera. I know it sounds cliche, but I was a horror fanatic. If I caught any paranormal incidents, I could use the physical pictures as proof. The place was fenced off, so I couldn't park my car inside the building. I snapped a picture of the outside of the building, then proceeded to climb the fence. I dropped to the floor on the other side, and immediately, a chill shot down my spine. I felt unusually nervous. I've never felt this worried on any of my previous ventures. I started my way to the building. As expected, it was creepier up close. There were long vines that streamed down the sides of the building and hung off the various edges. Tall grass surrounded the area, and small weeds sprung up from small cracks in the cement of the bottom floor. Usually, you'd find graffiti or even broken glass bottles or anything in a place like this, but not here. The place looked as if it was built and then left alone and never tampered with. I presumed that it was simply because I was on the first floor. On that note, nothing resided in the area. It just looked like an empty parking lot. I decided to move further up, so I made my way to the second floor. Upon entering, I immediately noticed the change in architecture. There was a wall that divided the entrance of the floor from the other side of the room. In the middle of the wall, where I was facing, was a door. A door? Why was there a door? It wasn't even big enough for a small car to fit through. I chuckled at the idea that this was probably the reason the building was abandoned. I pulled out my camera and took a picture. The small piece of paper ejected from the camera. I shook it, then inspected the photo. Nothing out of the ordinary. I placed it in the pocket of my backpack and walked up to the door and opened it. The second I entered the room, a putrid smell filled my nose. The smell was so bad, in fact, that I had to place my hand over my mouth and nose to keep from hurling. When I looked into the room, I saw there was something in the middle of the floor. From where I was standing, it looked like some sort of dead animal. The flies that darted around the corpse only further indicated that possibility. I hesitantly approached the middle of the room while covering the bottom half of my face with my shirt. Upon closer inspection, I realized that the thing was in fact a dead, mutilated pig. It had claw marks that streamed down to the lower half of its body, which was entirely missing. You could see the guts of the animal strung out of its body. I immediately received a sensation of utter horror. By this point, I had definitely seen enough. I turned around and made my way to the door. I placed my hand on the doorknob and was met with the realization that the door was locked. I sat there at the door for a good 3 minutes, frantically pulling the knob to no avail. I stepped back and took a deep breath. Now calm, I began to consider my options. I pulled out my phone and was met with no bars. Despite this, I knew I could still call 911. However, no one picked up. The phone just kept ringing. I tried not to panic, as it wouldn't help anything. Even so, I was still shocked. I thought that maybe I could jump off the side of the ledge. I walked over to the half wall of the building and peered over. My eyes widened with fear. Some way, and somehow, I was multiple stories higher than the second floor. Not just that, but the building seemed taller than before. I looked up to see the unbelievable. The building reached up above the clouds, and so on. I couldn't believe my own eyes. I pulled out my camera to snap a shot of what I was seeing. The second I heard the click of the camera, a loud noise started going off behind the door to the room. I could see physical movements on the door that looked like pounding. I stumbled backwards, almost falling down. The door looked like it was almost giving in. I stood up and began to run to the ramp that led to the next floor. When I got to the ramp, I began to hear another noise. I turned my head to see that the pig that was once dead on the ground was now looking over at me, squealing mildly. It should be dead, but yet it was screaming Bloody Mary. I couldn't give it another thought and continued up the ramp. Like before, this floor had a wall and then a door. I opened the door, and as I began to enter, I heard the door from the floor below me burst open, followed by heavy thumping footsteps rushing up the ramp. Adrenaline surged through my body as I quickly ran into the room and slammed the door behind me. I stumbled backwards and fell on my back. I sat up with my heart pounding, looking at the door. It took me a moment to realize that I no longer heard the footsteps, and I no longer heard the squealing pig. I waited a few seconds before laying back down to catch my breath. I felt no inclination to inspect the room behind me, nor did I want to sit back up. I decided to close my eyes and rest for a bit. I don't remember how long it was before I fell asleep. I awoke to crickets and a warm breeze that tickled my cheeks. I sat up dazed and confused for a few moments before I jolted to the standing position. It took me a moment before my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I saw the blue hue of night. The moment felt beautiful despite the previous events. I reached in my backpack and grabbed my flashlight. I noticed that my camera was already tucked in my backpack. When I flicked on the light, I realized that I was back on the first floor. Without even thinking, I rushed to the fence and practically threw myself over. I stumbled into my car and pulled out of the area and back onto the main road. When I finally could catch my breath, I looked into the rearview mirror. My eyes caught the building for 3 seconds, just before it disappeared behind the tree line. It looked completely normal to me. It was no longer a skyscraper that reached through the clouds. I felt a moment of relief. When I got back to the hotel I was staying in, I threw my backpack on the bed and sat down beside it. I thought that maybe it was all a dream. Maybe I passed out due to the heat and had a nightmare. I opened my backpack to eat a Lunchable when I saw them. 3 Polaroid pictures. I pulled them out and flipped through them. The first one was the picture of the abandoned building that I took when I arrived. The second was the picture of the door that I saw when I reached the second floor. So it really did happen. When I got to the third photo, my eyes widened. In the photo, I expected to see the building reaching into the skies. But instead, I saw myself standing next to some words on a wall that looked as if they were written in blood. The words read, "Never come back." I since burned the pictures and decided to forget the whole experience. I lost my will to ever explore abandoned buildings again. I'm writing this now to get it off my chest, and maybe even warn any people who plan on exploring an abandoned building in the future. The clock struck 9:07 when a blood-curdling scream echoed through the upper hallway of a Millbrook family home. A father jumped up from his usual spot on the sofa, where he had just started his usual routine of not thinking about anything in front of the TV, after a long day of thinking about getting home at work. The father, named Ted, rushed up the stairway to the bedroom of his daughter, named Ellie, whom he fathered with a mother named Helen. Ellie had become a difficult child since the family moved to Millbrook. Come to think of it, Helen became a lot more unpleasant as well to Ted. Ted didn't come to think of it, with his attention focused solely on avoiding Ellie's toys littered on the dim stairs. Not that he sought out other times to think of it either. His mother had shown a poor teacher on the subject of sharing emotions, and Ted's father had shown a poor example of how to be in the general vicinity of one's own children. So then, quite logically, Ted had grown to become a man who found the comfort of his sofa and his arguably mild case of post-labor exhaustion enough of an excuse not to seek to bridge the growing tear in his relationship he was far too well aware of. Even the slightest show of care might have proven enough to prevent a Millbrook family from being swallowed whole. But Ted didn't deal with unpleasant prospects well. Where Ted never faltered, though, was an unmistakable and unconditional sense of fatherhood. If there's ever a peak male form in moments like this, it just might have been that of a Millbrook man named Ted. His otherwise slouchy, slightly saggy, and severely sedentary body managed to reach speeds that would put any man to shame. After all, it was 8 past his daughter's bedtime, and this was not an acceptable time for a blood-curdling scream. When Ted threw open the purple door to his daughter's bedroom, he found her in none of the situations that would justify screams this alarming. He found her, in fact, entirely alive and perfectly healthy by any standards of visual inspection. Ted had gone into fatherhood, being told left and right about the difficulties and mental toll of raising a child. Someone, Ted thought often, should have at least notified him about how unnecessarily childish some children could be. Ted suppressed a flash of frustration as he stared at his daughter, who now, for no specific reason, decided to thrash around in her bed, a bed otherwise perfectly good for sleeping. She demanded a story, and not an interesting story, or at least one Ted hadn't already read to her 100 times. No, a story about a princess, or maybe one about a blue frog that sparkled when it croaked. She hadn't decided yet. Ted sat down at the edge of her bed with a sigh as he watched her skip across the room to her bookshelf. "Daddy, a new book!" "Oh, thank you, thank you!" She pushed the book into his hands and hugged him. Ted glanced around Allie's tiny frame and saw a rather raggedy-looking cover. Its black cover carried the title, The Backwords Book, in its center. White letters that seemed to fade around the edges, giving it almost the appearance of glowing, but not quite. Ted frowned for a few seconds and guided Ellie under the covers. This was not the first time that Helen had brought home some odd trinkets from one of her second-hand storage strolls, and so Ted defaulted to his habit of not really caring enough to bother questioning things. The first pages of the book were empty, but unlike its cover, the inside seemed brand new. Bright white, untouched pages. "Daddy," Ellie whined. Ted flipped through some more pages as his daughter's tiny feet started to pitter-patter against his back in a rather annoying fashion. "Go pick another book, doll," Ted lamely breathed out. "This one's empty." His thumb brushed the edges of the pages as he flipped through the entire book. Ted was already halfway in a standing position when he reached the last page and saw something his buttocks still floating indecisively a few inches over Ellie's bed. Ted flipped back to find the page again. To start, find the end? It said. Ted dropped his buttocks down on the bed, missing one of Ellie's tiny feet just barely. Her objections went unheard as her father's thumbs worked their way around the pages. As if appearing out of nowhere, he found another page he must have missed. This one just read. They ran, too late they ran, for to run away is to run towards the backwards man. Entirely inappropriate for a children's book. Entirely inappropriate for a book for any demographic Ted could think of, come to think of it. Images of strange folk danced through Ted's mind for a few seconds. Unkempt folk with wild hair and little concept of personal space and or hygiene. Out-of-the-box thinkers, as one would call them. At any rate, Ted could only imagine the kind of crowd he wouldn't wish to spend a minute with. What normal person would buy a book with just 2 printed pages in it, all the way at the end? One of the oddballs in Ted's mind instantly grew the face of his wife, who, he realized, did actually buy such a book. A child screeched and thundered her soft pink fists on the bed behind Ted. It took him a second to let go of the image of his wife, now drinking cheap beer in the back of a minivan, as 12 of her best but least washed friends danced around a fire, before he recognized the little, loud human as that of his own making. With Ted's curiosity entirely piqued, he managed only to murmur a few words halfway between an apology and an excuse before he started flipping pages again. Just, honey, wait. Daddy's going to... He flipped back to the page previous to the last one. A second. The last 2 words nearly fell out of Ted's gaping mouth. Perhaps it was the crudely drawn image of a child laying at the bottom of a flight of stairs that took Ted by surprise. Or perhaps what Ted found hard to process was that it seemed as if a new page kept appearing previous to the last page as he flipped. Surely he could not have missed all 3 pages as he flipped through the book the first time. Ted flipped 1 page back. Once again, an image, as if appearing out of nothing. A child throwing her tiny, unsocked feet down a flight of stairs. A dark, awkward figure drawn frantically right behind it. Another child was shoving her feet in Ted's chubby side at the same time. Ted, however, didn't seem to have enough blood in his body left to feel it. He felt the blood rushing in his ears, his head starting to spin. Ted managed to worm himself in a position of such low esteem at his place of employment that he was delegated only the most mundane and meaningless tasks. He prided himself on this achievement. The way his career stagnated meant he would have to work well into retirement age to pay off his humble Millbrook home, but in return, work was mostly reading the paper and waiting to refill the printer. Ted often thought of this, grinning gleefully behind his cup of coffee, as he saw his coworkers run from here to there, and from there to elsewhere, to further their career. But in a moment like this, Ted felt a sting of regret for being so wholly unable to comprehend something out of his comfort zone, due to being wholly unsatisfied with staying in it. This, of course, hardly helped, as his mind started whirling the more he flipped through the pages. The dark figure seemed to leap backwards, from each page to the previous one, hunting a child in reverse. Then a man, who seemed to have his back torn open after stumbling on a toy in the hallway on the previous page. Both the man and child retraced their steps to a bedroom, where what now was clearly a father reading a story, to what now was clearly his daughter listening to a story. Occasionally, Ted guided his thumb over the remaining pages and glanced at them passing, just to make sure he wasn't making things up and there really wasn't any writing or images, on the other pages. Ted managed to take control of his body again, at least to some degree. He almost fell over as he launched himself to a standing position, unintentionally pushing his daughter to the side. Ellie, incessantly screaming at this point, remained incredibly ignored. Her cries of "Daddy!" reverberated, the tones of her heels repeatedly thumping on the wooden floor. This was a new situation for Ellie as well. She used to think that she had it all figured out. First, you throw a tantrum. Then when you get what you want, you behave nicely, for a minimum of the time it takes to receive whatever it is you want. It seemed so logical to her now. The first time it didn't work, she saw no other option than to increase the intensity and volume of her tantrum. It seemed like such a waste of all her hard work, as she had spent the last years training her father so he came running at her slightest screech. The hard work that goes into a well-crafted tantrum often goes overlooked after all. Her father's mind went entirely blank. His grimacing face went stone cold in such a flash that it was almost audible. When Ellie stopped for just about 2 entire seconds to look up at her father, Ted dove into the book again, flipping pages at an impressive rate. Ellie's feet started up again and almost reaching the rate of Ted's racing heart. He flipped another page, a figure, though drawn as if in charcoal, crude and rudimentary, clearly a woman. Her figure peeking out from a cloak of darkness. A few lines to the side of her black-covered form made out to be a door in its frame. A closet door, perhaps. It was at this point that Ted heard a creaking mere feet to his left. Ted clenched his jaw as he inhaled sharply, the hairs on his back standing up as his eyes opened wide. The closet door creaked, no doubt about it. He threw another look at the page and swore he could recognize his wife's face in the figure. The room was dead quiet now. Even Ellie's sobbing seemed to stop on a moment's notice. Ted turned his head towards her and made a mental note. For the first time in his life, Ted wondered if his soft treatment of her had taught her to fake tears to get her way. But Ellie wasn't paying attention to her father, and so hadn't noticed him noticing her trickery. Her eyes were fixed on the closet door. And as Ted realized this, any thought of his daughter faded once more. His wife was in there, surely. Perhaps he was in over his head, and it was all a coincidence. The door creaked and opened just a tiny bit. He could swear he heard muffling. Ted leaped across the room and swung the door open, throwing the book aside. Ted surely was at his best when his family was in danger. A peak example of male prowess. Protection as his single purpose, the speed of a gazelle. Though, as often the case, the mental capacity of a frog. Or perhaps a slug. Something slimy and unlikable at any rate. In all the commotion, Ellie glanced down at the heavy object thrown between her legs. If one Millbrook man had only taken one more second to flip one more page, there wouldn't have been one Millbrook child staring confusedly at a page of a woman cloaked in the darkness of a closet which looked a lot like hers. The door of this new page now open, enough to uncover a second figure behind the woman. A man of sorts, in a way, at least somewhat shaped like a man, and signaling all the parts that make up a man, though very unlike any man Ellie had ever seen. Sitting with his spiny, rounded back towards the door, his ribs and his bony hips nearly piercing through his skin. Thin streaks of black hair, long enough to almost touch the ground. Limbs, frail-looking, but upsettingly long, folded along the sides of the figure, aside from one hand twisted inhumanely and placed on the head of a dead Millbrook wife's head, keeping it upright. the man's head hanging backwards, down his back, as if his exposed, curved neck was broken or boneless, thin lips spread grinning above his sharp, white eyes and veiny pale skin. An image that brought up all sorts of feelings of dislike in little Ellie. An ugly, unhappy image. Unacceptably unfit for her perfectly pink bedroom with princess purple doors. Another page flipped in the commotion. The last page, or the first, depending on perspective. As all things, both Ted and Ellie were too occupied to see the page. Ted trying his best to find his knees as he came face to face with his wife's body, and the unlikely figure holding her head. Ellie in turn leaping from the bed and out of the door with screams of pure terror. It was at this moment that Ted's mind came up to speed and managed to put things together as the unwelcome guest's twisted limbs unfolded before him. The Backwords man, Ted murmured as the hunt began.